everyone, this is Yana Smakula for SimonsSSTM.com, and thank you for joining me today. I'll be sharing a floral watercolor card using a gorgeous sketch ranunculus stamp set, and I'm going to jump right in and begin by watercoloring these gorgeous flowers. I'm first going to treat my watercolor cardstock, and this is Arch's cold pressed watercolor card, with an anti-static powder tool to help me keep my embossed images clean. And then I'm going to stamp one large flower and two smaller flowers onto this cardstock using clear sticky ink and cover that with white embossing powder. I also stamped one more image as I had first planned to make a slightly different card, but I changed my mind along the way, so I ended up not using it. The embossing powder that I'm using here is opaque bright white from Wow. It's a nice detailed powder that works great for images like these. I'm going to quickly heat set these with my heat tool and then go ahead and watercolor. I love the messy look of watercolor, so this is something I always try to mimic on my cards. I like to call it messy elegance. So I'm going to do a wet on wet technique. I think it works beautifully on Arch's paper in particular. The color moves beautifully on its own and I don't have to do a lot of work. So first I'm adding a layer of water to my images, and you can see my water isn't clear, but that's okay. I think it adds a very soft undertone to the paper, creates sort of like a base layer of the color for my flowers. To color these, I'm going to use my Kansei Tambi watercolors, and I'm starting with yellow, adding it to two of my flowers, and I'm not coloring the entire images, I'm just dropping the color mostly in the center and letting it move on its own. Because there's a lot of water, that water picks up the color and moves it on the image. I think the images look more natural this way. Next color I'm using is a nice vibrant pink, and I'm adding it to the second flower, again not covering the entire surface, leaving some sections free from color. With the wet on wet technique, I love to mix my colors directly on the paper, so I'm adding a bit of that pink to the largest flower and mixing it with yellow slightly. Then I'm coming in and adding lots more of that pink to intensify the color and also adding it to the smaller flower, and you can see how nicely it moves on the paper and spreads around. The heat embossing acts like a resist here and guides the water and the pigment along the lines of the flower, creating beautiful effects. To speed things up, I'm again going to use my heat tool and quickly zap these to make sure the images are dry. Now I had a little bit too much pigment and water in some sections, so I used my paper towel to soak it up, and now I'm using my scissors to cut these images out. Now the beauty of these flowers is you can change their size by cutting a few of the outer layers off. So I only have two size flowers here, but I can cut them out and change the size to make it look like all three flowers are different in size. Here I have the flowers cut out, and you can clearly see the difference. The pink one is the smallest here. So now I'm creating a cluster of images and building a background for my card. I'm just picking out the images I want to use and clustering them around the florals. Next, I'm going to come in with my Misty tool. Now, if you don't have a Misty, you can use a large clear block and just pick up all of the images at once. The images, the stamps, do not overlap. They lay flat, so it's not a problem to pick them up all at once. Now that I have them on my Misty door, I can go ahead and stamp them onto the background. I'm also going to watercolor these, so once again I'm using watercolor paper. Instead of heat embossing, I'm going to use Simon's Intense Black ink. And because I'm using Misty, I'm able to double stamp these to fix the stamping imperfections I had when I stamped these the first time. This is watercolor paper that has some texture to it, so there are bound to be imperfections here. I'm trying to figure out how I want my flowers placed, and once I have a general idea, I'm going to go ahead and continue watercoloring. I'm using the same wet on wet technique, but adding a base layer of slightly orangey water first. It's not going to show much. In fact, it doesn't show at all in the photos, but it is visible in real life. I'm going to zoom in here so you can see up close the coloring process. Again, I'm being rather messy here and just dropping color over black stamped images and letting the paper and water do the work for me. First, I'm using pink and coloring several flowers in pink. These will form a visual triangle around my heat embossed flowers in the center. Next, I'm using yellow and again adding it to three sections around my center area to keep things balanced. And finally, I'm using green for the leaves. You can see I'm working with two brushes here, a large round brush, and I'm using it to add water, and a small round detail brush, and I'm using that one to add color to the images. I'm going to once again use my heat tool to speed up the drying time of this piece. And once that is done, I'm going to trim this panel with my Simon Says Stamp stitched rectangle die to create a smaller element. I've adhered a sheet of beautiful plaid pattern paper from May kit from Simon onto an A2 top folding card base, and I was just about ready to adhere my die cut panel on top when I decided I needed to make it a bit smaller. So I did a bit of creative die cutting here and used the same stitched rectangle die to make this panel smaller. There's a smaller die in this set, but it was a little bit too small for my project, so I just used this old trick and layered the die over a part of the die cut, and that's how I trimmed just a part of it. Next, I stamped a sentiment onto my panel. I used "You Are So Very Amazing," and because I was still stamping onto watercolor paper that is textured, I again used my Misty tool. I think I ended up triple stamping it for super dark black. I also decided I wanted to shape the flowers a little bit as I didn't want them to be just flat. So I shaped each with my fingers and ended up adhering the largest one using glue, the medium size using foam adhesive, and for the smallest flower I doubled up on the height of the foam adhesive to pop it up even more. Next, I adhered this panel onto my card base and decided I needed to stamp a few more images to complete this card. So I stamped a little heart under the sentiment and added several stamped dots around the images. I think these little dots are very fun and they're a nice background filler. I think they added quite a lot to this project. Lastly, I added lots of clear sequins from Pretty Pink Posh in various sizes, and that finished my card. So here's a closer look at this watercolor card. You are so very amazing. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll see you next time. Bye!